Hi folks, sincere apologies for the technical glitches. We've had a few logistics to work through. Fabulous to have everybody joining us. Thank you so much for your persistence with the technical issues and your interest in learning a bit more about groundwater in our gorgeous part of the world. It is my great pleasure. I'm Trent Griffiths. I currently work at the Corangamite CMA. It's my great pleasure to be facilitating today, but I'd love to hand over to the president of Friends of the Barwon, the group that is bringing this webinar series to us, Andrea.
Hi everyone. Thanks Trent, and sorry about the delay that we've had today. Welcome to our third instalment of our Nature Positive webinar series. I'm Andrea Montgomery and the president of Friends of the Barwon, as Trent said. The Friends of the Barwon is a catchment-wide community group working to protect and restore the waterways in the Barwon system. We work, live and care for the lands, waters and seas of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation and the Gulidjan and Gadibuddinal people of the Maar Nation, and we acknowledge them as traditional custodians of these intertwined ecosystems. Today's webinar follows on from our focus last year on waterway pollutants, and we're now taking a dive below the Earth's surface and exploring underground waterways with the question, why should we care about groundwater? We're lucky enough to have two extremely knowledgeable presenters today in Peter Dahlhaus, Associate Professor and Principal Research Fellow at Federation University, and Alex Murray, DEECA's Senior Manager of Water Licensing Policy. If you just skip to the next slide, Tatiana, I'll just go through a couple of housekeeping things before we get started to ensure we have a webinar that runs smoothly. Please keep your microphone muted and the camera off during the presentation. If you've got any questions or comments throughout the presentations, please use the chat function and note these, and we'll address the questions at the end of both presenters are finished. Just a reminder that we are recording this webinar, so you will be able to rewatch and share it at a later date. We'd also love it if you could complete the feedback survey at the end of today's presentation. It won't take long to do. I'll now hand over to Trent Griffiths from the Corangamite CMA. Trent's a long-time supporter of the Friends of the Barwon, and he's going to introduce our speakers and act as moderator for today's webinar. So thanks, Trent.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks, Andrea. Absolutely thrilled to have Peter and Alex along today. This is the bit where I make them uncomfortable by lauding their skills and experience in this area. So Associate Professor Peter Dahlhaus. Peter is Principal Research Fellow at the Centre for E-Research and Digital Innovation, aka CERDI, at Federation University, and is based in Ballarat. He is an expert, dare I say, guru on groundwater systems in southwest Victoria, and regularly advises government and communities on groundwater issues. And Peter and his colleagues built and maintain Visualising Victoria's Groundwater website, which if you haven't checked it out, please do. It's an incredible resource. So Peter's going to be speaking first. After Peter, we'll hear from Alex Murray. Alex is the co-senior manager for water licensing policy at DEECA. Alex has almost a decade of experience working in water policy and a particular interest in evidence-based policy and working with our communities, which partly why you're here today, Alex. Alex is currently leading the team to implement Groundwater Management 2030, which is focused on ensuring Victoria's entitlement framework continues to share and protect our water resources well into the future, recognising those multiple kind of values of social, economic, environmental and cultural values. So, but my great pleasure to start by handing over to Peter to take us through somehow in 20 minutes or so, everything you know about groundwater in southwest Victoria.
Yeah, thanks very much, Trent.
Perfect.
Yep. So we're right. So I'm assuming we're back at the start there. So this is, thank you. So this really should be called, underground contributions to waterways and why we should care about groundwater. Federation University also acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which our campuses, centres and field stations are. I'm currently in Ballarat, so in Waterways country. Now back to school for a minute. And you remember from your high school geography, maybe even your primary school geography, about, you know, the fact that underground water or groundwater exists in bodies of rocks called aquifers. And so there's effectively two kinds of aquifers. This one's called an unconfined aquifer. It's the most common. And it's where the water, rainwater mostly, percolates into the ground and sits in the pore spaces, the cracks, the fissures, the spaces within the materials within the ground. And then the other one is a confined aquifer. So a confined aquifer is quite different in a sense that it is only open to the surface at a place. So it's where you've got rock strata, in this case, shown by these bent bits here, and the rock strata outcrops on the highlands, and the water enters into that. And so when you poke a bore down into it, the water will rise up to the height of the pressure surface there. So that's like the Great Artesian Basin is the most common of those. And in our region, the Barwon Downs bore field, where the recharge area is up on the Barongarook High with the Odine Swamp or the Big Swamp, where the recharge area is, and then the bores are down on the flats in Barwon Down. We're not talking about these today much because confined aquifers, while they do contribute to waterways, it's fairly rare in our region, and mostly it's the unconfined parts of the aquifer. So, the world's saturated beneath our feet. The water falls, from the sky onto the ground, and then some of it gets used and taken up by vegetation and stuff, but a proportion of it seeps into the ground, and a proportion of that seeps into the ground, usually around 2 or 3% of the water, ends up making it all the way down to the water table. And where the water table ends up being a rather subdued reflection of the landscape. Where the landscape goes up, the water table goes up underneath it, but not as much as the landscape. Where the landscape is down in the valley, the water table's also down, and usually closer to the surface there. And so where the water table intersects the surface, that's where you get groundwater discharge in the form of springs and seeps and swamps and rivers and lakes. Sort of thing. And so the water table sits in the saturated zone and the unsaturated zone above it. So groundwater moves from, the higher areas to the lower areas. It moves just under the force of gravity down through the aquifers and out from the recharge areas, which are the areas, where the water enters the ground, to the discharge areas where it leaves the ground, the system. And that flow just occurs under gravity. Now, that groundwater can take days or millennia, to move from recharge to discharge, depending on the path it takes. You have to imagine yourself as a drop of water in an aquifer. And that drop of water is trying to negotiate its way through all of the cracks and fissures and pore spaces, along with all the other drops of water. So imagine you're in some kind of mosh pit of water droplets trying to negotiate your way around all the rocks and obstacles in your way. And so it takes time for that to happen. Now, the rate at which groundwater moves is really dependent on two things. It's on the hydraulic gradient, which in this case, in this little diagram, is shown by the slope on the water table. So you can imagine that if that slope's steep, the water moves faster. And if the slope's flat, it moves much slower. It's quite sluggish. So in a planar landscape like the Victorian volcanic plains, the groundwater moves very slowly and very sluggishly towards discharge, whereas in the upland areas like the Waterways or say even parts of the Central Highlands, it moves faster just on the basis of the slope. And of course, the other thing that's in your way when you're moving through the aquifer are all the aquifer materials. And so the hydraulic conductivity of the aquifer materials, you have to imagine, trying to squeeze through shale compared to flowing through clean gravel. It's much easier to flow through, stuff that's got a lot of pore space than stuff that hasn't. And so when you think about, the rates, the basement rocks, so the basement rocks, shale, granite, the marls, the Otway group marls, some of them, really tight stuff. So we did some work at Ballarat Goldfields, for example, just down the road here, where we looked at the groundwater flow rates through the basement rocks, the slates and shales, and they're about 5 microns a day. So, hair on your head is 60 microns in diameter. So, the groundwater is barely moving through those rocks. If you had a fractured sandstone, and in the Goldfields example, where they hit a quartz reef or something like that, the water moves faster because there are more fractures and more openings, and those openings have got little, aperture. The aperture of the openings is wider, and so the groundwater will move at millimeters a day. Where you've got sands, so to continue the Goldfields example, where you might hit a buried river valley, the so-called deep leads of Ballarat, river valleys that existed in the past and then were covered over by the volcanics. When the miners got into those river valleys, they were in sands and gravels and coarse cobbles and so on, and they generally worked up to their waist in water because the pumps couldn't keep up with the amount of flow going through those old river channels. So where you've got sands and gravels and so on, the groundwater might move at metres a day. And of course, in a limestone cave, when you're down in the limestone cave at Buchan Caves or Janolan Caves or somewhere, you'll see the water flowing at kilometres a day through big openings in the cave. So, it varies enormously. So let's say, for argument's sake, that we had, a typical landscape here where we've got a hill and dale. So up here we've got a hill with trees on it, and down there a dale with a river at the bottom of it. And then underneath that, there's a water table. Now that water table at the moment, at the end of autumn, is usually, in a typical year, if such a thing exists now with climate change, but in a typical year, it would be at its lowest at the end of autumn, just before we start winter. And it would be at its highest, usually at the end of spring, just before we start summer. Spring's our wettest months. And so, the water table rises during that period. So the water table flaps up and down a bit, depending on the seasons. And so if we were to drill a bore up here on the high country, we might see and monitor the groundwater, we might see that, water level and time in a graph. We might see the water levels jumping up and down through the seasons. And in a run of wet years, if we had a run of wet years, the water table will slowly rise, and in a run of dry years, it'll drop away. And that's currently the case, of course, where the water tables are getting pretty low at the moment. Whereas if you're down in the valley, in the dale, near the river, the water table fluctuations, they fluctuate with the seasonal variations, but effectively the difference between the high and low water tables is much lower there. And so that while you get seasonal variations, you don't really get the same kind of ups and downs. And so the message here is that groundwater discharge is more or less continuous, but the rate, of course, varies according to the gradient. For the discharge to stop, the water table would have to drop below that level. And so this is what we see with streams. This is why streams keep flowing during dry periods like now. It's because there's virtually no surface water runoff into the streams. So the only water that's sort of keeping the streams moving and flowing is that groundwater that seeps into the streams. It's the base flow. And that occurs where the water table level is higher than the stream level. So the groundwater can flow under the force of gravity into the stream. Whereas if the water table was lower than the stream level, you'd have a losing stream where the stream water flows back into the groundwater. And most rivers in southwest Victoria depend on groundwater for environmental flows. Almost all the rivers that we've got, particularly in the Barwon system, are gaining streams. So streams where the Barwon River at the moment is, whatever water's in the Barwon River is there largely because it's receiving groundwater flow to keep that river flowing. And the same for the Moorabool and the Lee. The Lee gets a bit of water actually from, the sewage farm discharge, so the wastewater treatment plant in Ballarat, and also from the mine dewatering, the gold mine dewatering. So it gets supplementary flows from other areas. And of course, these flows keep, the iconic species alive, and blackfish and platypus and so on, alive in those streams. So it's really important. And the other thing about, groundwater is that it's also important for plants. So a lot of plants called phreatophytes that depend on shallow water tables. So they've got their roots into the shallow water table. So particularly plants in, wetlands and lakes. That photo there is at Reedy Lake, where I'm just checking a bore in the Reedy Lake. And it's also important for these stygofauna, these little creatures that live in groundwater. So here is some examples from Australia. These creatures are only, very tiny, like, a few millimetres in length. And stygofauna are, really useful because in that area where they enter the streams, they obviously provide food for the creatures in the stream as well. So if we look at the Barwon, Lee and Moorabool catchments here, so we look at so this is the gradient of the rivers. So this is distance on the bottom and elevation on the vertical axis, and 200 kilometres to Lake Conowari down the bottom here. And if you look at the Barwon River, it kind of just drops straight out of the Waterways there and then onto the plains, where it flows along the plains and then does this kind of weird crossing of the plain at Winchelsea to Inverleigh to join the Lee River, and then down here through the Moorabool and then down across the Moolap sunk lands into Barwon Heads. And so the gradient of the river there is quite flat, whereas the Lee, as the Lee flows down off the Central Highlands here, just get rid of that. The Lee flows down off the Central Highlands here. It flows down and then hits the plains just before Inverleigh, near the Lee Gorge there, and then just sort of flows along. And the Moorabool even starts its life even at a higher elevation and then sort of falls off the edge of the Central Highlands down around Maud area and then down into join the Barwon. So the opportunity for groundwater to enter these rivers really occurs where you've got, that intersection, which is sort of interesting to see. So when we go and look at the depth to water table, and here's the depth to water table, you'll see that across the plains and across the Moolap sunk lands, the depth to water table is generally less than 5 metres. So, if you were to drill a hole, you don't have to drill very deep before you hit the water table in those areas. So when you look at the Barwon, which falls out of the Waterways here, there's not a lot of groundwater from the headlands, from the headwaters rather, that enter into the Barwon, because the water table there is, 50 metres deep or so in the Waterways. But where it comes out of that, it starts to gain groundwater all the way across the plains and down through, and With the Lee, again, it's the bottom parts that really, and the Moorabool, quite similar. The Moorabool's spring fed, incidentally, up the top. Groundwater springs up here. Springs are slightly different in that sense. And when you look at the water table salinity, it reflects this in a sense. Now, salinity has groundwater, as it travels in its sluggish way through the aquifers and, snakes sluggishly through the aquifers, it tends to get minerals absorbed out of the aquifers into the groundwater, and it also has sort of chemical changes along its flow path that occur. And so the rule of thumb really is that the longer the water's been in the system, the longer the travel time, it approaches seawater in its salinity. And so up here in the Waterways, fresh recharge sort of thing, it's quite fresh water, and then as it goes down along the plains, it gets into that sluggish, very slow groundwater entry, and you can see that the salinity increases. I'd like to just draw your attention to this area just here. This is the volcanic plains area. We did some work some years ago looking at the flow paths along there. And here's how they look, mapping the groundwater flow. So these black lines are the flow paths. So you can see that, and the bit underneath is actually the groundwater elevation. Right? So you can see underneath that, say, Lake Colac, which is outside the Barwon system, granted, but on the eastern side, the water entering Lake Colac flows a matter of only tens of metres, whereas on the northern side it flows, maybe a kilometre or so. But over here on the Barwon, you've got water flow paths that extend for 20 or 25 kilometres. So the water entering the Barwon in that midsection, where it goes across the plains, is actually drawn from a very big catchment. And some of this water goes through Lake Murderduke. Lake Murderduke's just in here. You might be able to see it, and the water flows into the western side of groundwater flows into the western side of Lake Murderduke and out the eastern side of Lake Murderduke. And in the meantime, when it sits in the lake for a little while, it increases in salinity. So an awful lot of salinity enters the Barwon at that point there. And so just to conclude on this, really, imagine this area before, any sort of intervention in groundwater. You would have had a landscape with a water table underneath and the water entering the river or the lake. And then once intervention started, originally around, the time that Europeans came, the water wells that they dug were generally fairly shallow water wells that didn't really, affect things too much. And then after 1900, there was sort of steam drills and other stuff, and people put water, there was a limit to how far you could drill, and people put windmills on, and the windmills are fairly slow pumping. And so the water table was drawn down when the pumps are on. The water table's drawn down, but not so much that it's a fairly local effect. From the 1960s onwards, drilling technologies took us deeper, much deeper, and put in electric submersible pumps. And then when you flick the switch, the drawdown on those can be quite larger because you've got more volume that you're sucking out, and the groundwater, takes its time to catch up. And so what happens is that you start interfering with your neighbours' bores and so on, and this has caused all sorts of havoc around Ballarat in particular, but other areas within the catchment as well. And then if you include, a number of bores that exploit the groundwater, you can end up drying out the discharge areas, so the river or lake. So it really impacts on the bit, and it's a really hard thing because the take-home message here is that there's lots of groundwater in the system in storage, but it's the bit at the top that needs to be managed most carefully, and that's a really wicked problem for the groundwater managers, because you've got a hell of a lot in storage, but it's the bit at the top that sort of feeds into the groundwater dependent ecosystems that we need to manage most of all. And just a plug for the VVG. So the VVG is the portal, the web portal that we all go to. There's lots and lots of bores in the region, and you can click on them and get the information about them, whatever information there is. They don't all have good information. And you can also drill a virtual bore. So over here on the left-hand side, you can see a little menu, and if you click on drill a virtual bore, you can click anywhere on the map, and it'll come up with an estimation of groundwater salinity and depth of water table, which drillers and other people find quite useful. And so that's it from me.
Such an incredible amount of knowledge you have, Peter. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us. Would love people to put questions in the chat. With many thanks, Peter, we will hand over to Alex to talk us through your approach to Groundwater 2030.
So I want to start off by saying I am in no way anywhere close to the groundwater expert that Peter is. I am the co-senior manager of water licensing policy at DEECA, and our area is really looking at how we share and manage our resources, and particularly in both surface water and groundwater across the state. We do have a very knowledgeable technical team behind us from the groundwater space, but certainly, wouldn't want to call myself anywhere near the expert that Peter is in the science of groundwater. But I am much more of an entitlement and water resource management nerd, so I'll try to keep it brief on some of those things because it can be dry. I want to start off by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the countries that we're all meeting on today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri country in northeast Melbourne, and honour the elders past and present. As Trent alluded to, I am here to talk to you today about Groundwater Management 2030. So Groundwater Management 2030 was launched in 2022 and is a statement of groundwater priorities for, it says the next 7 years, but we're now down to the next 5 years. It is a partnership between DEECA and our rural water corporations, who are our groundwater managers across the state, but also some other relevant stakeholders, so working closely on certain things, or will be working closely on certain things with catchment management authorities and certainly community groups across the state, and with our traditional owners. It's looking at how we improve our groundwater management between now and 2030, and is a real commitment to strong groundwater management that can adjust to meet opportunities and challenges into the future. So we know that we have better knowledge now than we did in the past about what the community values about our water resources. We also know we have better data, and we have also future challenges and more experience, such as climate change, and more experience managing these systems over the last few decades. I want to start by just talking briefly about our current groundwater management framework, and what the challenges are that we face and what we're trying to look at through GM 2030. So very first of all, what makes groundwater different to surface water and what makes it challenging? So the number one thing is certainly its hidden nature. So groundwater being below the surface makes it harder to both monitor and to measure. Is everyone getting the presentation? I think there's some messages saying people aren't. So everyone can see what I'm presenting?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay, great. I think it's not not coming up for some people. Great. So yeah, the hidden nature of the resource, it makes it obviously harder to measure and monitor, but it also makes it harder for the community to connect with. So certainly people feel a lot of connection to their surface water systems, but groundwater systems are harder to connect with and harder to understand for the community, which means that it hasn't always got the attention that surface water systems has had. We have slow response times in our groundwater, in a lot of our groundwater systems, as Peter was alluding to there, which means it can be hard to understand the impact until you have quite a lot of data over many years. Complex hydrogeology, which Peter touched on just before. System heterogeneity. So we've got systems that we are managing as one large system, but there might be sections of it that are connected to the surface water, sections that are more confined, sections with different rates of recharge and discharge. So it can make that, also challenges in managing that. Interconnected systems, so aquifers that influence other aquifers and how they, shallow and deeper and how these kind of fit together can also be difficult. Long-term storage in some of these aquifers. So in some, particularly in our confined aquifers, I have heard a stat, and Peter may be able to correct me or fact check me here, but in some of our systems we have recharge in the confined aquifers that has been there since the ice age. So that is a very long time period to understand impacts. And then, as Peter covered as well, we've got significant connection to our groundwater systems and the landscape around us in some of our systems. So we've got lots of groundwater dependent ecosystems across the state that need to be well managed. So from a bulk water perspective, this is kind of a very brief look at how we manage the resource from a bulk perspective in Victoria. So our leading piece of legislation is the Victorian Water Act, which has been around since 1989, but there was actually a Groundwater Act before that, and so we have been actively in some way or another trying to manage our groundwater systems since the 60s, but obviously that has been limited by how much information and data and understanding we've had of our groundwater systems. So from a bulk water perspective, we have our systems, our groundwater systems, kind of in two classifications. We have our groundwater management units or groundwater management areas. They use quite interchangeably those terms, and they are kind of our defined areas where we certainly get we've had a lot more use, and so they have been defined as management units, so we can more intensively manage those. And our unincorporated and undeclared systems, where we have far less entitlements or very few entitlements issued in those systems and far less use. So that's for various reasons. Obviously, it has got to do with the land use around it and how intensive production is in the area, the access to that groundwater, and things like how usable it is. So, increased salinity will mean that there's not much interest in the groundwater use in those areas. So in our groundwater management units, they are all capped with what's called a permissible consumptive volume. So that means that there is a limit on how many licenses or the volume of licenses that can be issued in those areas. The areas that we have seen a substantial kind of not only number of licenses issued in the past, but also a substantial amount of use, and areas where we were starting to see or have seen significant risks from that use, they have been declared under the Water Act as water supply protection areas. I'll get into that a little bit further down this track, because that is quite a lengthy legislative process, so we do have some issues with that process. But once that is done, they can have what's called a statutory management plan developed, which puts in place a whole lot of statutory rules with how that system needs to be managed. We also have the equivalent that isn't statutory called a local management plan, and our rural water corporations work with the community on those. They are not statutory, but they also set out the local local management rules for the area. So they can be used to kind of have the same or similar effect to the statutory management plans, but they are not legislative. So with those local management rules, things like the trade rules and certainly some restriction triggers. So at what level of what groundwater levels you start to hit restrictions on your licences to make sure that use is managed to a acceptable risk. And in all those areas, we now have substantial monitoring and metering. So that's been around since around the 90s that we have all groundwater metered or groundwater use metered, so that we have had better data over the last 20 years about our groundwater use and how those systems are responding. Sorry, just changing slides. And then the next part of our management kind of framework is how individuals access water. So groundwater use across the state is licensed with a Section 51 take and use licence, except where it is for domestic and stock use. So domestic and stock users don't hold a Section 51 take and use licence. It's a private right under the Water Act in both groundwater and surface water. For groundwater, those users do have to have a Section 67 works licence to put in a bore. But they are not metered, and they don't have those same conditions on use as the Section 51 licence holders. So Section 51 licence holders also have what's called a works licence to both put in their bore and to operate their bore. The rural water corporations manage those licences, and they, under the Section 40 assessments of the Water Act, they have to actually assess the impact of issuing those licences. So they can only issue up to those caps, but they also have to look at the local impacts to the environment and other users of basically issuing that licence, and they can also place conditions on those licences, including metering, when the licence can be used in some circumstances, etc. We also have a range of non-legislative policies and guidelines that guide those the issuing of those licences, like the ministerial policies for take and use, and probably significant to this group is the ministerial guidelines for groundwater dependent ecosystems, which gives guidance to our catchment management authorities who get referred licences when they're issued in those groundwater dependent ecosystems or near those systems, and to assess the impact that they might have. So very, very quickly, these graphs or these maps are a little bit hard to read, but just you can see there in the green, that is all the areas in the state that are unincorporated, so they're not one of those groundwater management areas. You can see that in the groundwater management areas or units, that's where we really see the bulk of our licences on issue. And you can see in the yellow, although this map might be a little bit outdated, some of those water supply protection areas that have been declared through the Water Act for that more intensive management because of the volume of licences and the volume of use. I won't spend too long on it, but this map is showing a similar thing, but this is showing the concentration of use rather than licences on issue. So you can see again that there are certain, 35%, only the licences are only used up to 35%, I think, on average, the volume of licences, which obviously speaks to how much, they could increase in use over time, which is a risk we need to manage. But you can see that it's really concentrated in certain areas of the state, and the southwest being one of those areas of high concentration. We do manage based on a risk assessment. So as I mentioned, in the unincorporated lower risk areas, we certainly have less use and less licences issued. We don't have caps on entitlements in those areas at the moment. but they are still licensed. So use is still licensed there. So the rural water corporations will assess the risk of individual licenses. In those systems where we do have a lot of licenses on issues, but use currently is well controlled, we have those local management plans and those caps in place. So we have those, we have those local rules that make sure that they're taking that local context into consideration when in the management. And then in those higher risk areas is where we have those water supply protection areas declared, and we have statutory management plans. And a lot of those areas have, or a number of those areas have use triggers where the use of your licenses starts to be restricted once we're seeing the level of the aquifer drop to an unacceptable level. So some of the challenges in our groundwater management, we've only had an effective groundwater observation bore network and metering since the 90s, which means a lot of our previous management decisions were really based on limited data. So we certainly, I think the intention has been to make sure that the resources are managed and capped effectively, but obviously when you are using limited data, those management decisions are limited. Managers have been taking that risk-based approach, but there's certainly an opportunity to make sure we are better proactively managing for risks into the future. Current management framework is certainly robust and we do have the tools there, but it certainly needs to be more responsive to groundwater values and certainly emerging challenges. So I mentioned those water supply protection areas and statutory management plans. So they take a really, really lengthy process to put in place, and they're very, very difficult to amend as well. And so often those are local management plans are used instead, which is effectively manage the resource, but it certainly doesn't allow that adaptive management to really happen really quickly when we've got those lengthy processes. And we definitely have significantly more information over the last 20 years, certainly more experience in extensively managing the groundwater resources, and a better understanding of the values of our communities that the communities place on water. And so we've gone through several sustainable water strategy processes intensively with the community. We also have our Water is Life roadmap for traditional owner access to water, and we have obviously that more experience in managing, so we have a better idea of what people value and what the community values in their water resources, which is also important when we're making management decisions. So GM 2030 is the vision for sustainable use of groundwater that supports existing and new users, protects the ecosystems, and supports living cultural landscapes. So there's 3 key outcome areas that we're looking at under GM 2030. Number 1 is the improved shared understanding of groundwater and its uses for evidence-based management. So that is really looking at that foundational information and the better data we have, and making sure that our management decisions are based on the better information. 2 is looking at the modern tools in the statewide framework for flexible and cost-effective groundwater management. So that's looking at the framework we use to manage groundwater on a bulk level, whether it's right, what we need to make change, where we need to make changes. And 3 is a streamlined and effective licensing, trade rules and control on groundwater use that supports changing water users. So that's making sure that those rules and processes around individual access to water are well managed, and again are based on the better information that we have over the last 20 years. So what's happening at the moment under GM 2030? So we've done a lot of foundational work so far under GM 2030, and we're moving into a space where we'll certainly be out more talking about what some of the proposals are, and certainly some of the outcomes from that foundational work. So the first one there is the Sustainable Yields Technical Assessment. which is due for release in Q3 this year. I'll go into that in a second, a little bit more detail about that. Review of our licensing practice and guidelines is certainly underway, and that includes a review of the groundwater dependent ecosystem guidelines. So making sure that they've now been in existence for about 10 years, so making sure that the basis of information for those is good and that they clearly guide that decision making. We've looked at mapping the licensing and management framework to have a look at some of the pros and cons of the tools that we currently have and where there are opportunities for improvements. Investigation into groundwater information and accessibility. So we're in the process of making sure that we do a bit of an overhaul of how we present information about groundwater, but also access to groundwater and how we manage groundwater. There has been a pilot study into the barriers of trade in the Southwest Limestone, and Southern Rural Water has actually opened a groundwater trading platform for across the state. So we're looking at the application of that for other rural water corporations and whether that is effective as a statewide way of developing those trading markets for groundwater. And we have, obviously, every year we update an annual status of where we're up to. Just very quickly, I know I'm probably at time now, but the Sustainable Yields Assessment, which has been released in Q3 this year, is a statewide technical assessment of groundwater availability and a review of the limits on take that are based on that assessment. So we really want to look at whether the current management stacks up against our improved understanding of what those sustainable limits might be. So the technical assessment aims to use that last 20 or so years we have of better monitoring and better use data and update our sustainable yields assumptions that we've previously used to look at the caps on entitlements. We have a public release plan for Q3 in 2025, this year. So we will be out talking to the community about those results, and we'll be reviewing local management arrangements to see how they're stacking up against that technical assessment. And so there may be immediate local management improvements that we're proposing as a result of that assessment, but we'll also be looking at how those results can be used for better management in the longer term under that wider GM 2030 work program. So very quickly, what's coming up?
Sorry.
That's okay.
Alex, 2 seconds, sorry. We've just gone 1 o'clock. I just wanted to let everybody know who's still here that we are going to record all of the Q&A. So I know there's lots of questions. For anyone that has a commitment now and has to drop off, we will record the questions and the responses, and we'll send those around in a recording following this session. So sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to grab people before they have to drop off.
I'm conscious of time.
Fabulous. Thank you.
What's coming up? We've got the results of the Sustainable Yield Project, which I know that everyone will be very interested in. So they'll be released in the second half of this year, and we'll be looking at how our local management stacks up, as I've just spoken to. We'll be working with the Victorian Regional Water Monitoring Partnership and the community to develop our 10-year monitoring strategy for the future to guide decision making and development of our monitoring plans moving forward. We'll be looking at the progress under GM 2030 and doing a bit of a where we're up to and what we're kind of looking at in terms of our priorities under the program now that we're kind of halfway through, and a lot of that foundational work has been complete. So we'll be out talking about that towards the end of this year and start of 2026. And we're continuing to work with traditional owners and Aboriginal communities to address barriers to accessing groundwater and to understand the parts of GM 2030 that are meaningful to them and that they would like involvement in. So there is a great GM 2030 website where we keep updated when we're out talking about things and when things have been progressed, and we do release an annual statement each year about what we have done through the year. And you can also contact the GM 2030 team through gm.2030@deeca.vic.gov.au if you have any questions or if you want to be registered to keep up to date with the progress.
This has been an incredible session. Your knowledge and your insights are really, really appreciated. I'm going to hand over to Andrea to close us out.
Thanks, Trent. Yeah, as Trent said, it has been a really really great talk, and you've given us so much knowledge. I'm still imagining myself, Peter, in a mosh pit with all those water droplets and maybe the Stygofauna in there dancing away as well. And maybe I was thinking, Alex, it might be good to get you back later in the year when you've got your results from your sustainable yields project, and we can have a look at those. I think that'd be really interesting for our members.
Absolutely, Andrea.
But yeah, great. And thanks so much to Kate Manning and Tatiana Ress from Bowen Water for your technical support and getting this webinar underway today. We really appreciate the collaboration from Bowen Water. And thanks to Trent for moderating and facilitating today's webinar. We really appreciate the work you've also put into organising the delivery of the webinar, and also Liz Hamilton for your work in the administration of getting it out there to everybody. If you could fill out the survey, which you've already seen up on your screen, that would be great because it helps us design future webinars. And we will hopefully have another webinar coming up in the next couple of months, so keep your eye out for information around that. Friends of Barwon are always ready to welcome new members to our group, so if you aren't already in our membership, please consider signing up to support our advocacy work. And a big thank you to those who've donated to the group today. When you've registered for the webinar, your support's really appreciated, and those funds are very welcome to continue on our work. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming and being patient while we had a few issues at the start, but hopefully you've all got something out of today's presentations. And yeah, thanks a lot for coming along. We'll see you next time, hopefully.